So, from now on, every episode, we are going to defend an episode of New Who against Hellbent, suggested by you lot. So if you have an episode you think's worse than Hellbent, suggest it and we'll defend it. And of course, this being the first one, we had to start with something big. And it was suggested by a commenter by the name of Troll Plays. And his suggestion is the end of time. Starting big. So this is what he says. I consider the end of time to be... Oh, by the way, if you haven't seen the end of time, big red flag right now. Spoilers. We're going to be getting into heavy spoilers. So this is what Trollplay says. I consider the end of time to be way worse than Hellbent. Disclaimer, I don't hate Hellbent. Come on. Gotta respect his opinion. Yep. The tone is serious. No, it's not. I like the end of time. The tone's not serious. For most of it. Although it gets serious.
The tone, because I was rewatching both episodes earlier, the tone is all over the place. Now, this is an interesting one, because I don't hate End of Time, but I'm not a big fan of it. But I do think it's leagues better than Hellbent. But sorry, we'll...
Yes, so he says the tone is serious despite many events being a bit too silly and to take seriously. They somehow made Sim's master into more of a joke with his feed me. Oh, well, he doesn't say feed me, he says dinner time. Feed me is the idiot's lantern. So you got that a bit off, but I'll give you a pass. And that chicken scene. I hate the cult of Saxon, it makes no sense. Who are these people? I hate that the Doctor is moping all the time, and I despise the restaurant scene where the Doctor says regeneration feels like dying. RTD knew that Smith's casting was controversial, so why did he want to sabotage the show by making fans instantly hate him? I have a different opinion on that. Even the final words have to be the worst in the show's history, as it once again reinforces the idea that change is bad, which is baffling because change is what allowed the show to survive in the first place. Yes, you make a good point, but that's not how I see that scene. Yeah, I know you do. And for that, I hate that. I should say that it isn't my least favourite because I know there is some good, but the bad far outweighs the good in my opinion. So, should I go first or do you want to go first? Right. I've done some preparation for this. So, I'm not going to go into everything that I think about the end of time, because I'm going to save that for the video. But obviously, when we watch the end of time, Jake won't have seen Hellbent. So what I think I might do now is compare the two and their similarities. So the first thing I'm going to go into is Gallifrey and the Time Lords. So, in RTD's for 4 seasons, he utilised a lot of the A-list Doctor Who villains for the finales. For example, the Daleks, the Cybermen, the Master Davros. And for his final story, he was looking for that big attraction that we hadn't seen yet. And of course, you could go with a respectable but not huge villain, say the Ice Warriors, the Zygons, or the Great Intelligence, something like that. But seemingly, the only massive A-list villain that the new series hadn't seen up to that point was, of course, the Time Lords. And obviously, that came from the Time War that was set up when Doctor Who returned. What Russell T Davies was doing before he bowed out of the show was giving you a taste of the conflict in the Time War. Up to this point, it had all been stories and legends. And to actually get to see the Doctor confront the Time Lords in person, and to see that confrontation was a big deal. It was a big deal.
That is something I agree with. I made a note of that in my head as I was rewatching it today. The return of the Time Lords, which predominantly, like, there's hints of it in the first one, but the cliffhanger is, because you think the cliffhanger is going to be the Master turning everyone into himself is A, dumb, B, inconsequential to the actual story which is being told here, where the Time Lords returned, and you had the beautiful and magniflorious Timothy Dalton delivering his beautiful speeches and stuff, and it was treated as like this is the biggest thing yet. This is bigger than the Master. This is bigger than Davros. This is bigger than the Daleks. This is bigger than the Cybermen. This is it. This is the end game.
They made it feel like the way he was doing his narration, like the Doctor and the Master were these little kids playing games, whereas he was in the background.
And they even, like, and, hang on, I'll let you speak first.
Okay, cool. So yeah, they made it a big deal. Whether or not the events were consequential or not is debatable, but I personally really liked seeing the Doctor lose himself in fear of the Time Lords, even holding a gun, which was against his own morals, yet this fear for his own life and the universe around him had driven him to boiling point. And also, Timothy Dalton as Rassilon is like a knife through butter, and I could listen to him speak all day, which is just...
Also the best James Bond. He's also the best James Bond.
I have to watch his movies. I haven't seen his movies. I know. Yeah. I've seen some clips of that James Bond though, and yeah, he's good. He's good. He's got those piercing eyes, you know.
He basically did what Daniel Craig did, but 20 years beforehand and better.
Yeah, from what I've seen, Timothy Dalton as James Bond, he throws away the playboy side of it.
Roger Moore. There's like he says one or two one-liners across two movies, but the rest of it, like he's a sociopath, and it's amazing.
I mean, I can't judge him because I haven't seen his movies, but I don't know, there's something about Sean Connery's iconic look and his playboyness and his, you know what I mean. It's hard to separate yourself from that iconic James.
Is like that is James Bond in pop culture.
Yeah.
But
I'll have to wait and see when I watch those movies. Obviously, we're talking about the end of time and Hell Bent. So we're talking about that confrontation between the Doctor and the Time Lords. So then you compare that to Hell Bent. Hell Bent is the story of the Doctor returning to Gallifrey, or at least
10 years for us.
after 10 years, or
Billions for him.
or at least we thought. Similar to the end of time, the Doctor was going through a lot of grief, and in Heaven Sent it was beautifully illustrated that he had overcome his loss and was ready to confront the Time Lords. But instead, what we got wasn't that. There was no conflict. There was nothing that led to the events in any logical sense. Within the first 20 minutes of the story, the Doctor kicked Rassilon off Gallifrey, and the Time Lords ran off like a bunch of pussies, with their tails tucked between their legs. Contrast to the godlike power that they had in the end of time. And also, that scene...
Oh, you may be about to say what I'm about to say, so you finish your sentence first.
Compare the tension between the Doctor and Rassilon in the end of time to Hell Bent. It's worlds apart.
And the thing is, and this is not just from a performance standpoint, but the writing of Rassilon seems like and to be fair to Hellbent, which is a statement I'm going to say a lot because I want to give it the benefit of the doubt, but it is trash. To be fair to Hellbent, yeah, for argument's sake, it has been a long time since for Rassilon's timeline. I mean, he's regenerated, he's changed, personality shift. But the Rassilon and Hellbent seems much more desperate to find leadership. Like he's like, I'm in control. I'm like he can feel it slipping through his fingers. He's much sort of like more less in control and less imposing. And that's not just because of the actor. That's the writing as well. Whereas you compare that to the one scene where the woman says, "Perhaps it is time to end it." He just vaporizes her and says, "I will not die." That Rassilon would not let I know he's regenerated and I know it's been a long time, but we haven't been given substantial enough reason as to why that character would not just turn to the soldiers who refused to shoot the Doctor and just there was no explanation. There was no, and then it just felt like it was leading on to, oh, perhaps we'll see Rassilon down the line. And even if we do, Rassilon's been permanently damaged because of Hellbent. Because now, whenever we see him next, it's going to be like, well, the last time we saw you, you had no power. You weren't. It's like what they did to him. It's like what they did to Omega in Arc of Infinity. Took this most imposing and badass and powerful and interesting character and turned him into,
Omega in Three Doctors is Timothy Dalton in End of Time, and then Omega in Arc of Infinity is whatever. What's his name in Hellbent? The Maester Luwin guy.
remember the actor's name. That actor is a good actor, but he also, it just Rassilon, in my mind, even like in the Five Doctors, when he's just the floating head, he is a presence. He is something to be feared, and I understand.
He's meant to be an over-the-top character as well.
And I understand. It's the whole point of the episode that the Doctor's come through this, and he's sick of it. He's hell-bent on getting his way. But the fact that is just immediate, the whole Rassilon conflict, the whole Gallifrey conflict is just pushed to the side. I grew up with this Gallifrey subplot being like this big thing that would eventually come to fruition, right? And even after this happened, I tried to give the episode a benefit of the doubt, and things trailed off even further. But it felt like a personal insult that it was just, the Gallifrey thing was just pushed to the side. Like, I know that he uses Gallifrey to break the rules of time so he can get Clara out, but I mean, actually having inner conflict, like the Time Lords returning, there's so much to do with that, and Moffat just disregarded it. I know. It was Hell-bent made me hate Doctor Who for a long time. When we met, I did not like Doctor Who because I had just seen Hell-bent. Like, I just was sick of it. I hated it because I was like, well, what's the point? Any long-term story I could get committed to. Even the one long-term story, I wasn't a fan of Clara, but I loved the way she went out and faced the... sorry, I'm just...
Yeah. I'm just gonna... You could just ramble on. Anyway, so they had godlike power in the end of time. And following that, there was no conflict anymore, and the one thing that led to the next, and then all of the Doctor's decision-making in Hell-bent from then on felt completely unjustified and out of character. And the fact is, when I watch Hell-bent, I sometimes feel like Stephen Moffat tries to copy the high-stakes plot of The End of Time, with the Doctor shooting the General in cold blood, which the Doctor never followed through on in The End of Time. And of course, the Deus Ex Machina to trump all, the resurrection of Clara. Just... which ultimately becomes what the story is about, and Gallifrey is a complete afterthought. I think The End of Time puts a lot more thought into making Gallifrey a threat, whereas Hell-bent completely ruined it.
And it's not even that Gallifrey necessarily needed to be a threat, per se, because to be fair, the whole previous episode was setting up that the Doctor literally has spent almost what feels like an eternity in his own personal hell, so he's driven. I understand that. So him being the most powerful person on Gallifrey, I understand that, but it's the way they executed it completely undermined not only the Gallifrey stories that came before, but any Gallifrey stories that come after this. If Chris Chibnall ever wants to go to Gallifrey, he's fucked, because Moffat is just... unless he brings back Omega and makes... but even...
Moving on. My second point is what I like to call reactive storytelling. The End of Time and Hell-bent are both preceded by stories which push the Doctor to his limit, and I would argue are two of the greatest episodes Doctor Who's ever had, that being The Waters of Mars and Heaven Sent.
They are, respectively, Waters of Mars is tied with one other episode, which I won't spoil now, but you know what it is, I think. Waters of Mars, tied with one other, is my favourite Russell T Davies penned story. Heaven Sent is my favourite Moffat story. By a long shot. Heaven Sent made me fall, because I really enjoyed the show and I was sticking with it, and I was quite enjoying Series 9. Heaven Sent happened and I was like, oh my god, Doctor Who is the best thing on television again. It is so good. And then Hell-bent just ruined it.
I'll stop you there, because I don't want you to go on. The big difference with how the climax reacted to these setups is very different. I personally believe that The Waters of Mars leads into The End of Time with a consistent idea that the Doctor had become the only Time Lord in the universe, and he felt it was his responsibility to protect what he believed in and who he cared for. A lot of your interpretation of the Doctor's words can affect your perspective on the meaning behind it all, But I personally believe that the Doctor fearing death is part of his anxiety that, number one, if he regenerates and changes, he may not have the strength to be that savior anymore. And number two, if he dies outright, everything could turn to shit. With the Waters of Mars creating that inner conflict in the end of time, really showing how the Doctor can't deal with the weight on his shoulders anymore, it's a really sad, emotional, yet poetic end to possibly the most troubled Doctor we've ever had. And through all the pain, suffering, and angst, you can see that struggle in, well, I know everyone will disagree, but I think it's a well-constructed story arc for the 10th Doctor that he gets to that point where he is so conflicted with himself that... You know what I mean? Do you understand where I'm coming from with this?
The way I put it is, the whole I could have done so much more, I don't like. But that's what Russell was building towards. That entire year of specials, and even in Series 4 and beforehand as well, he was leading to a point. And this was it. Because people often say, oh, it was the 10th Doctor being egotistical. No. I think it ties in more with the 10th Doctor realizing he can't get away from the Time War. The Time War has haunted him. The Time War has changed him. I mean, because I know the Doctor's used guns before, but from memory, he never picked one up when he was Eccleston or Tennant up until that point. Or the Doctor's daughter as well. But like, yeah, but for the same reasons. And the thing is that when he had Rose, he sort of felt rejuvenated and he had love again, and even if it wasn't romantic love, just he felt humanity again, hope. He had hope. And then he had Martha. And what became of her? She became a soldier. She became a fighter. She ended up working with Torchwood. And Unit. She changed. What happened with Donna? She became this brilliant meta-crisis. I'm not saying that story was necessarily brilliant, but she was very intelligent in terms of what I mean by brilliant. She was very intelligent, and she found a purpose in life, and he had to take that away because otherwise she would die. Anything that he found that gave him hope was being taken away from him one by one by one by one, chipping away at him. So this heroic, romantic Doctor was being broken down back. And it all tied back to him having this PTSD ideals. He thought he got away from what he was as the Ninth Doctor. But the end of time, I find, is him just going back to as angry as he was in Dalek. I find that that's what that is. It's all been leading to the point that he's been chipped away at and chipped away at and chipped away at, and so much loss. Kind of similar to the Fifth Doctor as well. How everything, yeah, absolutely. How everything around, nowhere near as good, but yeah.
I wouldn't even say that, but you can tell that Davies is inspired by that idea.
And the whole, I don't like necessarily the wording of the speech, but I like I could do some. Yeah.
Some of the dialogue is a bit dodgy.
And the whole Camp Master thing, we'll get onto that, I'm sure. But just on this particular subject, it made sense. Russell had been building toward it. This was his intention. He was the Doctor who escaped the war, but then he hadn't. Everything he'd learnt was breaking down around him, and that's why that really indulgent farewell tour thing at the end made sense, because in a way it was him reminding himself of what he does this for. His friends, his friends, his family, as they say in Journey's End, in Journey's End, they refer to him as his family, and hooking Captain Jack up with a one-night stand and all that kind of thing,
And controversial as it is, part of the reason why I think I Don't Want to Go works is because he doesn't want to lose that.
Yeah. He's scared of what will come next, and I don't like the I don't Want to Go line because of that very reason. As you said, I feel like it alienates not just Smith, but Moffat as a showrunner and everyone who's the changing of the guard. It alienates the new.
Ultimately, Moffat did ruin the show.
But even at this point, I understand your criticism, but I feel like in terms of a story and a direction. There was a focus there, and it made sense. And
That's why I'm about to compare.
yeah,
I'm about to compare to Heaven Sent and Hell Bent, which could not be two more different stories entirely. We were talking before about how Russell T Davies, even if you don't like how the story happened and what panned out, it makes sense, and he was building to it this whole time with the 10th Doctor. Whereas with Heaven Sent and Hellbent could not be more different. The entire purpose of Heaven Sent was illustrating that the Doctor was getting over his grief of losing his friend, and it's beautiful. You truly feel like the Doctor could finally let go of Clara and move on to Gallifrey. Of course, when you get to Hellbent, it goes in the opposite direction and digs up all of what had just been seen and ruins it. Like it just brings up stuff that you didn't need to again, and it just ruins it. And the entire of Heaven Sent is undermined, and the Doctor's motivation in Hellbent doesn't at all follow up what happened in Heaven Sent. And in my opinion, it completely destroys everything that came before, including Face the Raven as well. In fact, for that matter, the whole show entirely. Simply put, the Doctor's character in Hellbent wasn't the Doctor in my eyes. And whilst you could argue the same for The End of Time, I personally believe how the character arcs built up to those episodes and then how they ended in those episodes makes a big difference.
yes, because I get the Hellbent thing. He was there for so long, and that's the whole one of the parts that makes the episode so brilliant is the ending of Heaven Sent. Yeah. No, I do. I get the intention. It's the execution that's terrible. It's just... and they... So what was the point of Hell? So the point of End of Time was to wrap up the 10th Doctor's story. This... And the 9th Doctor's story as well.
In a way, they are the same era.
Yeah, they are. To wrap up the whole RTD era. So everything was leading to a point, to the changing of the guard, to a changing of the tone, a shift. Whereas what Heaven Sent set up and what Hellbent delivered weren't the same. The Doctor just... There was no consistency to everything. And I think I found so many comments on Hellbent where people say, oh, but he'd been in there for so long and he was ready, he was just obsessed with that. But that's not what Heaven Sent presents as what's going on. Clara herself says, like, he needs to learn to move.
Even within Hellbent itself, she points out that the plot's wrong.
Yeah. And then they have the fucking diner. Like, people... The excuse I've seen for this is that, oh, she was becoming so much like the Doctor that she ended up becoming the Doctor in her own right. Fine. But why? What purpose did it serve? Where... What? 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 The...
There were some other things too that I liked about The End of Time. The first one obviously being Wilfred Mott. Wilfred Mott and The End of Time is amazing. He is... only someone like Russell T Davies could have come up with someone like that. His like a testament to Davies being able to write characters is Wilfred. Like the perfect example. This... Do you want to say anything on it?
Well, Wilfred, the thing is, Wilfred is such a pure character. He himself has been through a conflict. And there's this one line which was made to reference to what Bernard Cribbins had actually done when he was in the Air Force, which was, you never even killed a man. Don't say that like it's shameful. That is something that's very indicative of the whole 9th and 10th Doctor story. Getting over what they did in the war. Forgiving themselves. About forgiving themselves. And Wilfred had been through the war, but he became this loving and caring parental figure. Even in Turn Left, when everything was going to hell, the one person who stayed positive was Wilfred. He was a beacon of hope in a complete universe of darkness, literally. He was a sign of hope. He represented what the best of the Doctor was hope and humanity and empathy. And that's why him being the Doctor's companion in the 10th Doctor's companion, when the 10th Doctor was at his darkest, like even though he had the goofy sort of nature when he first arrived, as soon as they're like, oh, the Master's coming back and something else is happening, he goes into serious mode because he's like, okay, either I'm going to regenerate and I don't know what's coming next that could be dangerous, or I'm going to die. He doesn't know because it's been very vague up until this point. Wilfred is there to ground him, to keep him there. And then you know what happens with that? That scene, even though I don't like the subsequent speech, that moment where you realize Wilfred is the reason the Doctor's going to regenerate, you can't even get angry at it. It's just sad. Because Wilfred, who has been nothing but positive and light and sticking up for those he loves, he shot a paintball at a Dalek. And
the Fornox scene, you could argue, like I've heard people argue, like why is Russell T Davies running prophecies in Doctor Who? Yeah, whatever, sure, I understand that problem you have with it. But for me personally, my personal experience, the Nox scene, the Fornox scene from the End of Time is one of my favourite moments from New Who. It's unbelievable. It's
Wilfred being in this story as basically the protagonist alongside the Doctor, emotionally grounds this episode and stuff. And like the inclusion of Donna, I could go without, but yeah. But like her being there makes sense because Wilfred, yeah, of course, that doesn't bother me so much. But the fact that like lines like when the Master says, "Oh, your dad's still talking," or whatever it is, and then he says, "Well, I'd be proud if I was." Like that whole thing, and the fact that Wilfred is able to stand up to someone who is just one in his own mind. Like Wilfred doesn't know if this is ever going to be reversed, and he's still fighting alongside the Doctor because he believes in the Doctor, and that's what the 10th Doctor's arc is all about.
And you really get the feeling that if Wilfred wasn't there, everything would have been a disaster.
The Doctor quite probably would have shot Rassilon, would have shot the Master, would have done something horrible and irreversible like he does in Hell Bent. But it would have been justified because it would have the Time War thing. And the fact that Wilfred was there, as I said, it's the humanity, and it's like that speech that they have when they're talking about, oh, but you said your people were lovely, blah, 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 when he realizes that the Time Lords are returning and he just grabs the gun. There's every scene with the Doctor and Wilfred, even though I don't like the I'm going to die, Wilfred, blah, 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 blah speech. I don't like that. It makes sense within the arc that they have been building and the story that they've been building. Wilfred is the perfect representation of those who surround the Doctor with love, because he gives out so much love, they return it. And that's the whole point of it. It sounds really hokey, but that's the reason why End of Time is so powerful for so many people. Because
don't get that in Hellbent.
No, Hellbent is a bitter and twisted episode, which I wouldn't necessarily mind.
Well, because Midnight's a bitter and twisted episode.
Yeah, I adore Midnight. I adore And the Waters of Mars. Yeah. That's a bitter and twisted and vulgar episode, but it works within that storyline because it makes sense, because it's the logical progression of where they're going. The Doctor realizes, everyone's dying around me, but I'm the last of the Time Lords. I have this power. Why the hell shouldn't I use it? Maybe the Master was right.
Yeah. And then in Hellbent, the Doctor is reckless for just to be reckless because he's just angry. Yeah. And it's not earned. It's not earned. It's not as compelling as this idea of all this, like it's a different, like I could see arguments for the Doctor's actions in Hellbent, but it's not, I can't accept it.
There's not enough within Hellbent itself to justify where he was at the end of Heaven Sent to where he ends up in Hellbent.
It's reactive storytelling. Another thing that even though a lot of people find this off-putting, I personally, like, even if you hate where they go with it and what they do and what this character says, I think David Tennant's acting performance in The End of Time is brilliant. Like, the way he, like, he squeezes
It's
everything he can out of the
yeah.
emotion, you know?
We get everything from, like, whereas Capaldi, by no fault of his own, this is coming from the script, is just angry the whole time and then he's sad. David goes through all these nuances. Like, I was rewatching episode 2 of The End of Time, and people go on about how the Doctor being all over the top and stuff is quite... the Master being all over the top and stuff is really distracting, and it is in the first episode. But rewatch the second episode. He's actually really subdued. No.
It's closer to Series 3.
Yes, exactly. It's very much like Series 3 Master. Like, there's a scene in which they're sitting opposite each other at the beginning of episode 2, and the Doctor's talking about, like, the usual sort of differences between their beliefs. And there's just this wonderful line where the Doctor says, "I wonder what I'd be without you." Which is just so indicative.
Master, wasn't it his reaction to it? Like,
The Master for a moment was taken aback, and like you could see just their old friendship leading back to Gallifrey, and it's very melodramatic and stuff, but it feels earned because it's 5 years of build up to it. Not one episode.
there's so much poetry in The End of Time.
Yeah.
It's very...
For better or for worse, but in terms of... Because, like, I don't want to give my rating for the End of Time because I don't want to spoil it, but I don't like a lot of The End of Time, but I feel like it makes sense. It doesn't jar me. It doesn't jar me, and it doesn't feel like there's any... It doesn't feel like there's irreversible damage done.
There's an elevator.
Yes, even with something like the supposed Doctor's mother thing, the fact that it is supposed, we don't know, and that's one of these things that's better left unsaid. It doesn't need a follow-up within the context of the story. She is simply a Time Lord who resents Rassilon and seeing that Rassilon could vaporize her in a second. So what she does is she reaches out to the one person who she can, which is Wilfred, and she says, "You cannot tell the Doctor. You cannot, because he'll go and do Time War things, basically. He'll commit genocide again or something. You don't know what he's capable of." So they needed Wilfred to be that core, which is coming back to why Wilfred being the companion in the story is brilliant.
And she only reveals herself right at the point where the Doctor's wanting to shoot.
And whether or not it's his mother, I don't care. Nor should anyone care. It doesn't matter. What matters is she was the one who sent this message out to Wilfred. She was the one of the two that they say, the weeping angels of old, which is another thing which is like, take it or leave it, whatever. But like, yeah. It's something where, yeah, it's, yes.
Yes. Oh God, this is a tough one. I personally really enjoy the Master as a half-form lunatic. Even though it's not the Master, watching it as entertainment, I like it. I like that craziness.
Now, Batman Forever, the first Joel Schumacher... Batman Forever, the first foray, before it went into Batman and Robin, which was just... yeah.
The hellbent of Batman.
Yeah. Batman Forever is like a 3 out of 10 movie. But Jim Carrey's performance in that is so over the top and camp and silly and ridiculous. It's not what the Riddler should be, because he should be smart and calculating like he is in the comics. But boy, is it entertaining to see Jim Carrey bouncing off the walls and hamming it up in that green spandex. And that is the way I view John Sims' Master in the first one. I really don't like him being incomplete, and I agree with you 100% that the Cult of Saxon thing is bullshit. Like the whole setup of the lady who picked up the ring.
It's very plot device, isn't it?
Yeah, the fact that the lady who picked up the ring is just some woman.
And then he's brought back with freaking necromancy.
Yeah, that's stuff I agree. I agree completely with you on that.
Look, I can't defend that as a story. I can only say that I enjoyed watching it.
And that's the thing is, I enjoy them. The thing is, I'm never, even in the stuff I really don't like about End of Time, I find it always entertaining from frame one to the last frame. I am so engaged by it. It feels big and important as it should, and it feels, most of it in my eyes feels earned.
Yeah, it has that. I noticed a comment somewhere about they were talking about the Leisure Hive, and they would have wondered what it would have been like had the Leisure Hive been told, say, in the Russell T Davies era, with that sort of fairy dust magic effect on it that makes stories better than what they should be. You know.
Yeah, and the thing is, I mean, End of Time is a real mixed bag. But like and as I said in part 2, John Sim just becomes like he is at the in Last of the Time Lords. In fact, I would say he's even more subdued in that than he is at the end of the Last of the Time Lords, where he's all, I can't decide whether you should, and all that. John Sim's actually he's such an engaging presence in that in those scenes. And even in the first one, when they're in the junkyard, there's a scene where he's just talking about the Gallifrey. He's talking about Gallifrey, and yeah, when they're just before he starts shooting lasers out of his hands, and it gets all silly.
You're right. The tonal whiplash of that is like, what the fuck?
Yeah. But the scenes where it's just the Doctor and the Master talking about Gallifrey, it just. And that beautiful Murray Gold music is just extraordinary. I cannot give those scenes enough praise. And I think they're kind of buried under the fact that the Master is so over the top in the rest of the story. But those few scenes that are just, I think, better than anything in Hellbent.
Oh yeah. Even though the end of the story is fan wanky, the reunion tour. I really think it wraps up the RTD era nicely, and it's almost akin to Return of the King, in the sense that you get one last visit to all these characters. You see where they end up, like Martha and Mickey, Captain Jack and Alonzo. Wraps up the Torchwood arc. The best one is when he visits the woman from Human Nature. Like, I know it's all sentimental and stuff, but to see that.
It shows, it's something, it shows how they knew how good of a two-parter that is, and B, it's something that shows actually how important this woman, he knows how important this woman's sacrifice was to basically kill John Smith. And the fact that was she happy? Was she happy? That like sums up the whole thing. It's just finding serenity within yourself is like the whole thing that he's looking for post-war, and it's just.
And she says, "Were you?" And he can't speak because he's lost it all.
Yeah, I can get why some people might think this. Oh God, it's going on and on and on. But as someone who grew up watching, this was my childhood hero, and I would have been 12 when The End of Time was on. Like. That was amazing, and it still to this day is quite powerful because I'm like, everything is so indicative of the point of the 10th Doctor and the 9th Doctor to some extent as well. What Russell's mission statement was, whether you like it or not, it was a clear one.
And then also there's the scene where I love the poetry of how the story begins and ends with Donna getting married. It's such a lovely sort of arc, and you've got that iconic shot of Wilfred saluting the Doctor off. Even though some people don't like how the Doctor doesn't salute Wilfred, but I feel like that's part of his character. It's sort of jarring because a lot of people, because at the time the Doctor's in this real angsty mood, and people saying, "Oh, he's just being disrespectful," but I think that was intended to be part of his character.
Well, it's more indicative of, as I was saying, him trying to escape the war. He doesn't want to be a soldier anymore.
And then he salutes Cyberbrig and Death in Heaven, and it ruins all that.
That's not character growth. That is inconsistency.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Fuck. The End of Time has a lot of action-packed scenes that Hellbent is missing, and it's overall a very fun story to watch as opposed to Hellbent, which is very boring and poorly paced. For example, I know it's ripped off Star Wars, but there's that scene where they fly the ship down, and they're like shooting lasers at everyone, and then even though this is completely ridiculous and it retcons, like it makes Colin Baker's Doctor look like completely made of glass, but there's that scene where he jumps out of the ship and he flies down and hits the glass and hits the marble. Yeah, he probably should have died from that, but you know, it's fun to watch. Whereas in Hellbent, there's none of that.
There could be an argument to make that him falling through the glass was actually what began his regeneration. There's I've read an article. This is completely fan theory. I don't think this was the intention, but it's just fun to bring it up. That what he was actually beginning to boil over before he even went in the chamber because of the fall. But he was so desperate to prevent Gallifrey from going, he was willing to sacrifice himself because he thought he may die halfway through regeneration when he was standing, like when he was coming face to face with us all.
The only problem with that, and this kind of goes against my arguments with the last scene, is that if he was beginning to die then, he looks like a total cunt when he doesn't want to save Wilf. If that's true. That's the only thing.
Again, I don't think that was the intention. It was just a fun little theory that I wanted to bring up.
In turn, that makes him look like a complete asshole. Which some people do believe anyway, but...
Well, you look at End of Waters and Mars. True. He is an asshole in that.
Yeah, true. But, yeah, I don't want to believe that theory's true just because it makes my argument less valuable. But Hellbent doesn't have any action scenes that I can remember.
That's not necessarily a bad thing. Because Heaven Sent doesn't have any action scenes either, and it's still one of the most, like, it's flawless, but like...
More action scenes.
But...
What about, like, you got some moments, like, when he jumps out the window and...
The thing is about, if you're going to do a character-driven episode, make the characters interesting. Because, I mean, it's really the final 20 minutes is really a three-header between Capaldi, Clara, and Ashilda.
The worst TARDIS team.
And it... Ashilda is a nothing character. Like, she's got... nothing. She's just... Moffat had an interesting idea, but did nothing with it. Clara
did more damage to the show, but as a Moffat girl, she might be the worst one. Ashilda, like...
It's the two worst Moffat women in my eyes. Because most of Moffat's women... This is a conversation I'm sure we'll have later down the line. Most of Moffat's women are pretty much the same.
Yeah, except for a few exceptions, like Sally Sparrow is a pretty good character.
But she was, even then, that's because... And Madame de Pompadour. But that's because one episode. As opposed to writing about four.
And River Song and Silence in the Library.
Yes, River Song, which was first introduced, is the best River Song.
Hellbent cameos the Daleks, the Cybermen, and the Weeping Angels for no reason, and wastes them.
Yep. Yeah. And you could say the same for the what about the Sontarans in the End of Time, and what about the Slitheen? But Slitheen, Sontarans, Cybermen, Daleks, Weeping Angels, like, different levels, man. You just can't throw these things away without diminishing them.
Exactly, and it's also... I recently realised that was supposed to be the Matrix from the Deadly Assassin in Arc of Infinity. Now, granted, in Arc of Infinity, it isn't great. It's Omega's sort of torture chamber with all the weird lines and stuff. But it doesn't waste three of the best villains in Doctor Who history.
Yeah, absolutely not.
In fact, Stephen Moffat wastes his own creation, the Weeping Angels.
To be fair, he damaged them a little bit already, and their mystique, but like...
Yeah.
Crazy.
I mean, it was bad enough in Time with the Doctor. This was even worse. Literally, like, the Doctor and Clara are just walking through a hallway, and, oh, it's a Dalek. It's a Cyberman, it's a Weeping Angel.
And the thing is, I don't know if he was expecting us to be excited by the fact that they're on screen, but at this point, and I would imagine this is the case with most people, they just don't care. People don't care to see these things anymore. Like, in The Witch is Familiar, that was an exception because, hey, look, they're back on Skaro. hints of things to come later. Absolutely, they're back on Skaro. Oh, look, there's Davros. Like, that had a relevance to the story, why they were brought back. In this case, they were just like, hey, remember this? And I was like, yeah, I saw the Daleks at the beginning of the season. Who cares?
It just felt like lazy writing to me. Another thing is, this is more of a personal thing, it's not an objective thing. I just prefer the way RTD tells story over Moffat in general.
Same.
And I think that's part of the reason why I have an appeal for The End of Time, because of that.
Yeah, most definitely. Absolutely. I agree.
Because, yeah, it's difficult to say without going into lots of details, but Moffat just writes his stories on the spot.
It feels very much made up as it went along.
Yeah. Whereas Russell T Davies, even if you don't like his sentimentalness, at least he plans out his stories ahead.
There's a clear thought process gone. Like, certain things change, obviously. You can't plan 5 years in advance without certain things changing. But at least there was some distinct direction. He had an idea of where he wanted to go. That is so clear. And even things like, I don't know, the face of Bo being Jack. That was a clear retcon. But it was a fun one. It made it made things feel relevant. I don't know. It's just... There was more of a focus put on things, whereas Moffat just sort of goes like, oh, there's this thing, and there's this thing. Remember this thing? Oh, there's this thing, and no, that's that thing. Like, it just... Yeah, don't... Yeah.
Also, The End of Time, in my opinion, has a good sense of humour, whereas Hellbent has no sense of humour. Now, granted, Hellbent is supposed to be a serious story. That's probably why it has no jokes in it. But the fact that I can laugh at some of the jokes in The End of Time, and then with Hellbent, because there's no sense of humour, and it's replaced with storytelling that I don't enjoy, there's nothing to enjoy. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I agree. Like
And before you say that, this is part of the reason why I think Hellbent is going to be worse than most 80s Who, because even the bad 80s Who stories have some humour to them, unintentional or intentional. Whereas Hellbent completely tries to take itself seriously and fails.
It just falls completely flat in its face. It's just...
And you get jokes like, you know when the doctor says don't take a selfie? Like, I just want to punch the screen. It's not funny at all. It's just... It's cringy.
And, like, humour is a subjective thing, but even comparative to some of Moffat's other humour, it's just not funny and ill-timed and just... It doesn't work.
It doesn't work at all. Whereas with The End of Time, I actually do find a lot of it quite funny, especially the Master. I find that very, like, humorous, especially in part one.
And even if it's not... Even though the Master wasn't intended to be funny... It is very funny, so that's some form of entertainment. Yeah.
In The End of Time, you get fun characters, like Donna, like the Cactus People, like the Old People, and in Hellbent, you get cunts, like Clara, Ashilda, and a misandrous, male-hating, transgender time lady. You know what I'm talking about, don't you?
It's this out of place, like, there's this line that Moffat wrote in the script, which is supposed to be empowering, but it's just so out of place, and like, you've just regenerated. Why aren't, like, not just, for a moment, just ignore the context of the line. She's just been shot and regenerated. And she's not at all dazed or confused. Is the Doctor just incompetent at regenerating? Is it... And the Master, even though...
Completely unnecessary.
It was. It's like...
They had the Doctor, this character, who for 55 years... What?
The General, who was a carryover from the 50th, was the only supporting character I liked. And then they shot him, he transformed, And then when she was just running around doing her thing, she became super boring because Moffat gave her nothing to do. So even I could, like, this really misguided joke just fell flat because the character had no charisma and had no anything.
What I was going to say was, this character, particularly in New Who, but pretty much over the 55 years of the show, well, I guess it was 52 at that point, the Doctor had been built up as a passive character who got to breaking point, but they had the Doctor shoot the General in cold blood.
Who was his ally?
Who was his ally, just so that they could fit in some feminist propaganda into the story.
But it wasn't even. It wasn't even like a feminist propaganda thing. It was just a really poorly done joke, and it was.
It wasn't even feminist. It was literally male hating.
It wasn't. It wasn't like.
Saying,
Yeah.
God, I hated being a man.
It was. It was just.
For no reason.
And it was. And it wasn't. Like. Let's take a line from The Doctor Falls. The Master says, "Is the future going to be all girl?" And Capaldi says, "We can only hope." That works. And that's a funny line.
It also leads into Jodie.
Absolutely. That was in context. It was funny. It was well delivered. This other one just came out of nowhere and felt really strange and had a very confused message. And it wasn't...
It's almost like Stephen Moffat didn't realise he was having the Doctor kill someone.
Moffat just seemed like, everyone loves... It seems to come from a place of everyone loves Clara, which is not true. So I'm going to focus everything on Clara, so people are going to ignore whatever it is the Doctor does because he's going to be so focused on getting Clara back. Even though people who I know who did like Clara loved the way she went out, because she went out somewhat with a bang. It was really sad and emotional, but she...
Face the Raven is one of the highlights of New Who for me.
It's
a great episode.
It is brilliant. And she went out on a really high note. And even fans of Clara who I know were like, what the fuck? Why are they bringing her back? Because it made no... And it's not like she wasn't in Heaven Sent either. She was just in the previous episode. So it's...
And it made sense in Heaven Sent because she was like this. It was sort of like the Obi-Wan thing in A New Hope, where she's dead but she's still there, like
It's-
his conscience.
It's the because it's the Doctor's conscience, and I wouldn't have even minded if what the direction they went with was the Doctor becoming more sociopathic, and he's on Gallifrey and he's fighting against the oppressive regime that Rassilon was setting up, and we had Clara there as the voice in her as his head. That would have made sense, and it was a continuation of what happened in Heaven Sent. That would have been interesting, and then you could have some of the arguments that they did have in the show, but actually with proper context that made sense, and didn't just feel forced and out of nowhere, and just an ego wank for this character who's barely a character, is just paper thin fuckery.
Going back to
The general.
the general. Well, you were going to say something that led to that.
Well, it's basically like, it's just, even if it was like, because it seemed like the joke itself was supposed to be empowering. Like, and this is it's pointless to get political because this was such a one-off line, but it just, it was just, for me, I didn't find it as insulting as you did. I just found it baffling that I was more, because in fact, I remember the first time I watched the episode, I wasn't even paying attention to what she was saying because I was just like,
The Doctor just killed someone.
the Doctor just killed, and it wasn't like a big deal. Like the Doctor was,
It wasn't like
he was just doing it like
It
just.
wasn't like the end of time where they built up to it throughout the entire Tennant era, and then when he picks up the gun and faces them, it's this massive crescendo.
And the thing that really bugged me about it is because I heard people justify it as, he was in there for billions and billions of years. Yes, okay, but the General just helped the Doctor. The General basically was saying, "Look, Doctor, rules that you yourself have set out to protect, we can't allow you to break." And the Doctor's like, "Nah, fuck you." And it's just,
There's that one line that actually contradicts itself because of the end of time, when he says regeneration's like having a cold.
yeah, it's just, And even like
No, it's not. You heard the Doctor in the End of Time. Regeneration feels like dying.
and even if you don't like the regeneration feels like dying thing, and maybe each Doctor, every Time Lord feels regeneration differently, right? It's just so. It feels so neglectful. Even, and it's not even just of continuity that Russell T Davies set up, because I understand Moffat's his own writer. He has his own ideas, clearly. But my thing is, he contradicts himself, and he goes back on ideas that he himself set up, even though he didn't write Face the Raven. He approved it. He's the showrunner. This was part of his grand plan, right? And that was such a good send-off, and Heaven Sent was even better. And then Hellbent just systematically went back on everything good that Moffat had set up, including the 50th fucking anniversary. But look how much hope was in Matt Smith's eyes, right? At the end, when he says, "I'm going home."
And when you really think about it, that one line, regeneration feels like a cold, undermines everything that had come before it, classic and New Who. All the regenerations have been undermined by that line. If he's telling the truth in that line, that means that none of it was worth anything.
And then Colin Baker just... The Doctor's always been a sociopath then, so it's not a big deal, because apparently the regeneration has no effect, so he just strangled Perry because he liked it? What? It's just... And I don't want to get too hung up on continuity, because it's such a big show. I understand there'll be contradictions here and there.
You should break continuity sometimes to tell a good story, but to completely retcon the entire series to be pointless is unbelievably selfish.
Yeah. And I saw one comment that said, I didn't... like, Hellbent wasn't great, but I liked seeing the old TARDIS interior. Now, I'm of the belief that... which is great. Honestly, that's awesome for you. I do think that's great that you do get enjoyment from that. But I'm of the belief that just seeing something old does not immediately make me happy. They have to do something interesting with it.
It makes you wish you were watching Classic Who.
That's exactly it. That's exactly what I was going to say. Or even an Adventure in Space and Time. The best Doctor Who related content Mark Gatiss ever wrote. And I don't know what Moffat was thinking. Like, I don't mind it being a darker story, not at all. But all the optimism and all the hope that was built up, like, so he retcons Gallifrey being destroyed in Day of the Doctor, and he sets up, hey, we're going to go find it. And then he doesn't. And then
It's all summed up in that interview he did on YouTube recently, and it's when he said, I don't see a story in Returning to Gallifrey. Like, that to me explained everything that he did in Hellbent.
It just seems like... I don't know. It just seems wrong-headed. And anyway, as opposed to attacking Hellbent, we should get back onto defending End of Time.
Let's go on to the next thing. Most of all, the 10th Doctor had a consistent character arc, and you can anticipate where his character went in the End of Time, whereas Capaldi's character was inconsistent and unpredictable in a bad way, and his jarring change between Series 8 and 9 really didn't help in trying to relate to his motives and actions.
Absolutely. Like, you look at... I don't understand what Moffat's thinking was, where he started the season and he was coming out and he was playing Pretty Woman on the guitar and he was riding the tank and saying, dude... But I just don't understand the starting point. Ignoring Series 8, for example. The starting point is Series 9. And how he goes from that to the end of Series 9. Heaven Sent, I get that he was there for so long. But Heaven Sent itself doesn't say that he's going mad. The ending of Heaven Sent implies heavily that he's here to take back Gallifrey and return it to its former glory. That's the way I read it. Tell him I've come back the long way round, which ties into the 50th. And, okay, so he's telling the Time Lords, I'm back. So it's about the Time Lords. As opposed to just, I don't know, if he really wanted to talk to Clara, just sneaking in. And it really makes me gobsmacked thinking about how just Moffat went back on everything that he set up that was pretty decent. It's absolutely mad.
And even if you like Hellbent and hate Heaven Sent, the fact that it's inconsistent makes it a bad story as a whole. Because, like, you can't just tell one story and then completely tell another story that just undermines it. Like, to me, that is just not good writing.
No.
Whereas with Russell T Davies, even if you don't like the way it went, it all made sense and it all led to it, you know? This one's not exactly a point, it's more just an observation. My friends who've only seen New Who loved The End of Time and hated Hellbent.
Huh.
Which shows you a perspective of someone who's gone into this show just based on the continuity of the new series.
Time War and all these elements that are set up from day one. Now, I didn't expect Moffat to be beholden to Russell T Davies' writing, nor should he have been. But he should have done something of quality, which he didn't.
Something within his own season's continuity.
He went back on himself, which is the thing that baffles me the most. It's just there's so many layers of this that confuse me, and I don't want to say like I get super angry about it, but I was angry about it when I was watching it because I felt like I'd been done disservice. Like this past 12 weeks of viewing was wasted, and then even further back from that, it's just.
And lastly, the scene with the Doctor and Wilf on the spaceship talking about his dead wife and how the Doctor would be proud to have Wilf as his father, in my opinion, is 1,000 times better than anything in Hellbent, and that scene alone is reason enough for it to be better.
I agree, because there was the actual emotional connections with these well fleshed out established characters who actually had a thematic reason for being there, as well as just an in continuity and in universe reason for being what they are. It made logical sense. I agree.
So, Troll Plays, I hope you're watching this because we put a lot into preparing ourselves for this one. I'd like to hear your response to us, because I think it's a really good discussion sorry, I'm just looking at something. I think it's a really good discussion to have about The End of Time, because it is such a controversial episode, and it's one of those ones where I really feel like it all depends on your perspective, and I think there may be a chance that something similar is with Hellbent with perspectives, but I just, even with my bias against Clara, I still don't think it's a good story.
I try to look at every episode as objectively as I can, and I like to listen to other viewpoints. And some episodes I've lessened my dislike of. Doomsday, for example. Doomsday, I've been talked down from being lukewarm on to actually quite liking. But this one, all the responses and reasonings I've heard, just nothing convinces me of actual quality beyond personal preference. Whereas in this, so much of it seems objectively bad in terms of storytelling, not just because it's about Clara, but it is a bad story about Clara. Yeah. It is a poorly constructed and poorly thought out one.
Feel like if this story was being told with Tom Baker and Sarah Jane, it would still be a bad story.
Absolutely. Yes, it doesn't matter. You could interchange the Doctor and the Companion for any of them, and it would still be just as bad.
Well, I guess that wraps up our defense of The End of Time. That took a while. It's a big story, though. We had to... So yeah, just make sure to comment any others, and we will defend them against Hellbent. Right, so now we're going to find out what we're going to be watching next time. And funnily enough, I suddenly realised that the next classic story that I watch will be my 100th, which is a big moment. So, so we're now going to find out what my 100th classic story is going to be, and it's out of a list of supposed turds.
Okay.
So, anything you're hoping for?
No, I'm hoping I get another surprise like this where I'm thinking, it might end up being quite boring, but actually it's quite fun. Just hoping for something fun, even if it's bad fun. Just fun.
Okay, so now it's time to find out. One of the most infamous episodes of Doctor Who. Michael Grade said that this was the point where he wanted to cancel the show because it showed Doctor Who as embarrassing. Of course, next time we're going to be watching my 100th story, and this is actually one of those ones that has the potential to be as bad as Hellbent. Warriors of the Deep. Oh dear.